The annual proportion we have here is great if you want to do an exponential decay and complementary take-up, as we've seen in the charts over here. But it may not be very often that you actually want to have an exponential migration, and so you have to stand back and think, well, what would you actually be more likely to be looking for? And of course the answer is you could be looking for anything. You could be looking for a straight line migration, you could be looking for some kind of S-curve to have a gradual take-up and whatever, but by far the most common thing you would expect to be able to do is, let's say, a straight line migration over 2 years. And if you think about it, actually setting up an exponential parameter to control a straight line in 2 years is quite hard. If you're running in years, you could have it set to be 50% in year 3 and then 100% in year 4, but if you go in quarters that gets much more complicated, I promise you. So we went back to the parameters and thought, well, what else could we do to make this easier to work with? And we decided that whereas the proportion is a nice way of saying with a single number how do you want it to go, we felt that actually providing a profile to allow you to say prescriptively what should it look like would also be, in the end, probably easier to work with. And after experimenting with various options, we realized that the best way, or the most flexible way to approach this, is not to describe how much you have left, but to describe how quickly you want it to be removed, which is, if you think about it, is more directly analogous to the original proportion, which says how much to get rid of each year or each period. So we've added a new option called the relative profile, and this is intended as a way to say how much should we have, how much should we get rid of. And so obviously the intention is to use this as a time series input, so you can say over time how much you want to get rid of. And so you might think that an interpolated series would be the most flexible way to go, and it probably is, but actually for a straight line transition, the new straight line type we added in STEM 7.4 is actually even better suited to this, because you can start with a base value of none. You can have an increment, and this is the relative profile, so it means proportion of the demand. So we could say, let's get rid of 50%, and let's say we want to take the value of 0 in year 2, and basically each year by default it would say I would like to go from nothing taken away to 50% taken away to 100% taken away. And the way it's designed is when this goes over 100%, it just ignores it because it knows it's already finished. So that straight line time series says it goes up to the end of year 2, it has the base value of 0, and thereafter it increases at 50% per year. And what that's instructing STEM to do is to remove 50% of the demand by the end of year 3 and the rest by the end of year 4. And obviously you can imagine that you could use this to govern all sorts of straight lines, which should then just give you a straight line in the results, which is kind of what you want. So if I run the model like that, now my chart is going to go from being an exponential decay to being a very simple straight line transition over 2 years, and obviously it still has the complementary take-up. So you can imagine you could play around with all sorts of different numbers there to push that over a different number of years or different rates. There is one more option, which is rather than saying you want to do 50%, you might say you actually want to transition a specific number of customers or lines or cards or whatever in a particular period. So alternatively, I can go over here and change the description from being a relative profile to being an absolute profile. And then in here, rather than talking about a 50% increment, I could say, well, let's say I want to get rid of 200 customers per year, and let's say we will still do it after year 2. 200 out of the demand of 1,000, which means it's going to take 5 years to cover this. And if I run it again, let's look at what we get. So here's 1,000, and it's taken away 200, another 200, another 200, all the way down to 0. So this gives you much more control, because you can drive this either as a percentage of the starting demand or as an absolute number of customers. And essentially what you draw in your profile here, which in general could be done with an interpolated series if you want to be more prescriptive about the shape of it, whatever you do in the shape here will then turn into, upside down obviously, what happens to the remaining capacity of the old technology, and conversely again will then be the shape of the complementary take-up. And because this is telling it absolutely at a particular point in time how much demand to have left, it's not affected by the shorter time period issue, so you will always get that shape even if you run it in quarters or months, which again is another benefit. So as I illustrated in the earlier video, the most common approach with this sort of transition is to decommission the old equipment straight away. So I've left it with a 100% decommissioning proportion for the resource. In practice, there might be reasons to delay that. There could be just an operational delay because there is a process to go through, or it could be a real-life delay because you're simply focused on the new technology first, and maybe you only come back and worry about the old technology later. It could also be a contingency for hanging on to the equipment just in case there is a reason to repurpose it somewhere else in the business. So in general, you might want to delay the decommissioning, and if you do that, then we have the same options. You can use the same options independently for the decommissioning. So the thing is, if you set the decommissioning to be 100% all the time, it can only decommission as fast as the equipment is freed up. So effectively, set to 100% means it will get the same shape as the transition itself. Whereas, if you go back into the editor and back to where the decommissioning is controlled, so this is back to advanced, other details down here, if instead of saying 100%, either instantaneous or annual, because it doesn't make a difference, it's the same if it's 100%, if instead you said you wanted to do, let's say, a straight line decommissioning here, so I could go in here and say I want to do a relative profile, I could choose to make that relative profile later in time. So for this one, I could go in and make this one also a straight line just because it's easy. So basically we're going to say we want the base value to be 0, and we want it to change by 50% each year, and let's wait till year 7 because then our 5-year transition should be finished. And so if we look at that here first, so basically we're not going to do anything until that the 5-year transition is done, and that's not right, it's supposed to be from year 7. What have I done wrong? Yeah, I was saying year 5, it meant year 7. So basically we'll wait for the 5-year transition to finish, and then we'll do our decommissioning. And basically if I run the model through like that, then what you'll see in the results is now here's my transition over 5 years, old equipment, new equipment, and just because I've set it up this way, now we're going to defer all the decommissioning until after we finish with this. So this might be reflecting the I can't focus on more than one thing at one time scenario, and basically we're going to wait till it's all done, and then we're going to say, okay, now we're going to then decommission over 2 years the old equipment. So that's quite a lot of ideas communicated in this video, or these 2 videos, and to try and help you just understand the whole thing as a whole, I've saved some charts earlier which allow you to compare the different options, and that's based on a scenario structure. So back in the editor, what I can show you is that actually we have one dimension that controls the run period, either to run in years or in quarters or months, and I have another dimension which allows you to pick one of these different intended behaviors. So these particular scenarios are targeting the options for the requirement, where the bits in pink here are the ones we're going to be changing, and similarly the options for decommissioning under advanced other details, the pink bits here, we're also targeting. So if I put those down there, so the scenarios we have: annual proportion, relative profile, absolute profile, and instantaneous proportion are going to be different options for what to do with the original requirement. So we can see different ways of doing the transition, affecting the transition. And then the last one's annual profile, so AP means annual proportion rather, absolute profile even. It's going to be an absolute profile for the transition, so that 5-year transition we just saw, in conjunction with either a delayed proportion for the decommissioning, or a delayed relative profile, or a delayed absolute profile. So the one we just saw specifically was the annual profile plus a delayed relative profile. Because I've stored these with the scenarios, and because what I've actually been doing in the background is running all of these, they're probably all up to date now, but let me just make sure. So in the results program, I've also got up my sleeve a number of views to compare these, and so we've been looking just at the working model. So there are 5 predefined sets of charts, and they're still not up to date, which is very annoying because they were up to date just now. What have I done wrong? I can't think. So let me just force this through. That's very irritating. So it doesn't take very long, fortunately. So here are the charts. So in this first view, I'm comparing the instantaneous proportion versus the annual proportion for a transition. And so the top chart with the instantaneous proportion, this is the 7.4 behaviour, compared with the annual proportion, which is the 7.5 behaviour. And what you can see is that previously it was impacted by running in quarters or running in months, whereas now, rather gratifyingly, you get exactly the same results, or nearly exactly the same results, whichever way you do it. So that's the first point. The second point is we've then added the options for either a relative profile, so this was doing 50% over 2 years, or an absolute profile, this was doing 200 customers a year for as many years as it took. And as I commented at the time, because it's defined in absolute terms, in terms of saying by this year it should finish, it doesn't actually matter whether you run in quarters or months, because it's still looking at the actual point in time to see how far through the profile we should get. So it doesn't, apart from how frequently it updates the results, it doesn't make any difference at all in terms of whether you run in quarters or months. So that's the new flexibility, is to make the transition work like that. And then the next charts are looking at the same issues for decommissioning. So same comment in 7.4, if you used a proportion for decommissioning, then it would be impacted by the run period. If you ran in quarters or months, it no longer is, you'll get more or less the same results. And the same options are available for decommissioning as after the transition. So if you choose to delay it, then you can have the relative 50%, or you can have the absolute 200 customers. And finally, and this is, if you like, the putting it all together, for most flexibility you now have the option to have one set of choices to control the transition and another set of choices to control the decommissioning. So these charts are showing you across the screen it's annual, quarterly or monthly. Down the screen it's showing you, well, we're always using a relative profile for the transition, but the first row is showing an annual proportion for the decommissioning. The second row is showing a relative proportion for the decommissioning, this is 50% over 2 years. And the third row is showing an absolute profile, this is 200 customers each year. And the only observation I'll make at this stage is that it all looks fine apart from this chart here, which looks slightly suspect, and you can see that something goes slightly counter to intuition in this chart here. And the reason for this is a well-known and rather familiar gotcha with the proportion method, which is if you've got only a small finite number of things and you say I'd like to get rid of 50% of those, 50% may not amount to very many if they were of different ages, and it's kind of complicated, but basically the proportion isn't always able to go down neatly, whereas if you're saying this is how many I want to have left, it's much better able to give you finally the result you're after. So the basic point is there was, if you like, an issue to do with the handling the shorter time period, which is now resolved, and there is now a much more intuitive way to, if you like, draw the intended result you want to get, either with the transition or with potentially a separate decommissioning of resources. And so the reason for calling this video hands-on migration is because it literally allows you to get your hands on the results you want to end up with.